The sun blazed mercilessly over Claryville, a small town in southern Tennessee where even the shadows seemed hot. Sheriff Leroy Washington parked his official jeep outside the town's only clinic, a shabby one-story building with a faded sign. The air was thick with heat, and the sheriff unconsciously hesitated before getting out of the car. Something inside resisted this visit. Leroy was 45, and for the past 20 years he had served the law in this all-but-forgotten place. Tall, with a sturdy build and eyes that saw more than he would have liked, he had been both judge and jury for most local conflicts. There were two laws in Claryville, God's law and the Sheriff of Washington. Dr. Malcolm Freeman was waiting for him in his office. His graying beard and good-natured face usually lent confidence to his patients, but today the deep wrinkles on his forehead spoke of concern. "Leroy, have a seat." The doctor pointed to a worn chair across from his desk. The sheriff sank silently into the seat without removing his uniform hat. His eyes focused on the folder in the doctor's hands. "I got your test results," Malcolm said quietly, as if he was afraid someone might overhear them, even though the clinic was empty at this hour. "I'm afraid it's not good news." Leroy said nothing, but clenched his fists so that his knuckles turned white. "You're positive for HIV," the doctor said, and the words hung in the stifling air of the office. The sheriff didn't flinch. Outwardly, he remained the same unwavering officer of the law, but something inside him snapped. "Say that again." His voice was hoarse. "The HIV test was positive, Leroy. We double-checked it." Malcolm took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "I know it's a shock, but it's not a death sentence right now. Modern therapy allows—" "How?" Leroy interrupted him. "How could I have been infected?" The doctor hesitated, searching for words. HIV is transmitted in several ways. Contact with blood, use of non-sterile syringes. He paused. Sexual contact. The sheriff looked up at him hard. "I don't do drugs, Malcolm, and you know I haven't had a blood transfusion." There was an awkward silence. They both realized there was only one option left. "Chanel," Leroy said quietly. "I cannot draw such conclusions," said the doctor carefully. "But yes, if you are sure that there are no other ways of transmission, perhaps your wife. You should talk to her, convince her to get tested." Leroy rose slowly. His face became a mask. "How long? What? How much time do I have?" Malcolm shook his head. "With the right therapy. Years, decades. It's not what it used to be, but you have to start treatment right away." The sheriff headed for the exit. "Leroy," the doctor called out to him, "someone you have to tell. Don't carry this alone." "Thanks, Doc," the sheriff said without turning around. "I'll take care of it." Leaving the clinic, Leroy got into his car and stared at the hot asphalt for a long time. His mind refused to accept what he had heard. Chanel had been his wife for 15 years. They'd met at a church picnic when she'd first moved to Claryville. Tall, with skin the color of bitter chocolate and a smile that could light up the darkest evening, she'd won the young deputy's heart immediately. Their wedding was the small-town event of the year. Leroy couldn't believe Chanel could cheat on him, but there was no other explanation. He remembered how the last few months she had often stayed late at the clinic where she worked as a nurse, how she sometimes left to visit her sister in a neighboring town and returned with a new sparkle in her eyes, how she avoided intimacy, citing fatigue. The sheriff started the engine. He needed to think about the situation. He couldn't just barge home and accuse his wife. If she really was cheating on him, he needed to know with whom and why. The station was cool thanks to the old humming air conditioner. Deputy Letitia Brown was sorting papers when Leroy entered. She looked up and smiled welcomingly. "Chief, how was the doctor's visit? Nothing serious, I hope?" Letitia was 13 years younger than Leroy, energetic and dedicated to her work. After the death of her father, also a police officer, she had decided to follow in his footsteps, and Leroy had taken her under his wing. In the 5 years they'd been working together, she'd become not just an assistant, but a confidant. "It's okay," the sheriff lied. "Just a routine check." Letitia squinted, clearly not believing it, but didn't insist. "We're quiet today. Only Mrs. Johnson was complaining about the neighborhood kids again, saying they were smoking pot behind her shed." "Take care of it," Leroy said absent-mindedly as he went into his office. Closing the door, he sank into a chair and pulled out his cell phone. He dialed the number of the clinic where Chanel worked. "Good afternoon. This is Sheriff Washington. Is my wife on shift today?" "Good afternoon, Sheriff," a woman's voice answered. "Yeah, Chanel's here, but she's with a patient right now. Can I take a message?" "No, thanks," he hung up. "At least she's really at work." Leroy opened the top drawer of his desk and pulled out a bottle of bourbon and a glass. It was a violation of the rules, but tonight he didn't care about the rules. He poured the golden liquid and drank in a gulp, feeling the alcohol burn his throat. His musings were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Chief," Letitia poked her head into the office. "Andre Jackson just called. There's another fight at his bar. Andre owned the Blue Moon, the only bar in Claryville. He and Leroy had once been friends, but in recent years they'd drifted apart." "I can go myself," Letitia added, noticing the chief's unusual pallor. "No," Leroy stood up. "I'll do it." He needed to get some air, and dealing with drunken brawlers was better than sitting around thinking about his wife and HIV. The Blue Moon was on the edge of town, a one-story brick building with a neon sign that worked every once in a while. When Leroy went inside, Andre was already escorting two tipsy men out. "Oh, the sheriff's just in time," he grinned. "Everything's under control now, but it's good to see you." Andre was a large man with dreadlocks and a ponytail and a charming smile that had gotten him out of trouble with the law more than once. Leroy knew that Jackson sometimes dealt pot in addition to alcohol, but in a small town where everyone knew each other from childhood, some things were overlooked. "What happened?" the sheriff asked, looking around the half-empty bar. "The usual stuff. Construction workers from out of town got into a fight with the locals. No one got hurt except for two chairs." Leroy nodded and was about to leave when Andre called out to him. "Hey, you okay? You don't look so good." "I'm fine," the sheriff said. "Whatever you say," Andre shrugged. "Say hi to Chanel." Something in his tone made Leroy wary. Was there a special expression in Andre's voice when he said his wife's name? Or was it paranoia brought on by the news of her illness? Back at the station, the sheriff closed himself in his office and opened the call database on his computer. As a small-town sheriff, he had access to information that in larger places would have required a warrant. He entered Chanel's phone number and requested an itemization for the last 3 months. The results loaded a few minutes later. Leroy scrutinized the list of calls and messages. Most were familiar. Himself, the clinic, Chanel's friends. But one number repeated too often, especially in the evenings and on weekends. The number wasn't signed, but Leroy knew only one way to check it. He dialed the number from his office phone. After the third ring, a familiar voice answered. "Hello? Andre, it's Leroy. I wanted to check on those construction workers. Are they still in town?" A short pause. "Yeah, I think they're staying at a motel in the driveway. Why?" "Nothing, just checking, thank you." Leroy hung up the phone, feeling a chill go down his spine. Now he knew who had called his wife. Andre, his former friend. The man who met dozens of people at his bar every day, including passing truckers and seasonal workers. A man who could very well have been carrying HIV. That evening, Leroy returned home later than usual. Chanel was already there, cooking dinner. She kissed him on the cheek like she always did. "Rough day?" she asked, noticing his tension. "Ordinary," Leroy replied, studying her face. Now knowing what to look for, he noticed the subtle traces of secrets in her eyes. "And how are you doing at the clinic?" "Same as always." She turned back to the stove, avoiding his gaze. "Dr. Freeman asked about you. Said you stopped by today." "Yeah, just a routine checkup." "How'd it go?" "Normal," Leroy lied. He wasn't ready for this conversation. Not now. He had to know the truth first. "I'll be late tomorrow. I have to patrol the highway." "Good," she agreed easily. "I'll stay late at the clinic too. We've got new vaccines coming in." Leroy nodded, knowing he'd be watching her tomorrow. The next morning, the sheriff assigned Letitia to patrol while he stayed at the station, ostensibly to sort out paperwork. As soon as his deputy left, Leroy headed toward the clinic and parked off to the side where he could see the entrance. At lunchtime, he saw Chanel get out and head not to the cafe across the street where the clinic staff usually ate lunch, but to his car. Leroy started the engine and cautiously followed her. Chanel drove not home, but to the outskirts of town, to a small roadside motel. Leroy stopped in the distance and watched as she entered one of the rooms without even knocking. The sheriff sat in the car, clutching the steering wheel so tight his fingers went numb. 20 minutes later, the room door opened and Andre Jackson stepped out. He looked around, lit a cigarette, and went back inside. At that moment, something broke in Leroy Washington's soul. For 20 years, he had served law and order, protected the people, and was fair. And now his wife wasn't just cheating on him with a former friend, she'd infected him with a deadly disease. And apparently they both knew it otherwise. Why had Chanel avoided intimacy with him in recent months? The sheriff slowly turned the car around and drove back to the station. His face was calm, but his eyes had gone blank, like a dead man's. Letitia noticed this when she returned from her patrol. "Chief, are you all right?" she asked with genuine concern. "Yes," Leroy said without looking at her. "Just a little headache." But Letitia wouldn't be a good cop if she didn't notice details. Something had changed in her superior in the last 2 days. Something serious. She decided to keep a closer eye on him. For 3 days, Leroy had been watching Chanel. 3 days he watched his life fall apart brick by brick. He started making notes in a small notebook. Times he left, times he came back, phone calls. It was like a regular police investigation, only the subject was his own wife. Chanel had met Andre twice in the past few days, once at the same motel, the second time at his house on the outskirts of town. Each time she lied about work delays or meeting with friends. Each time, Leroy sat in his car with his headlights out and watched his marriage die. On the 4th day, he decided to hear their conversation. Leroy had purchased a small tape recorder from an electronics store in a neighboring town. He didn't want anyone in Claryville to know about his purchase. Toward evening, he parked outside Andre's house and, after waiting for Chanel to go inside, crept cautiously toward the backyard. The window to the kitchen was ajar. The June heat was unbearable. Leroy activated the recorder and brought it closer to the crack. Chanel and Andre's voices came through clearly. "I can't go on like this," Chanel said. "Leroy suspects something. He looks at me differently." "You're just panicking." Andre's voice sounded relaxed. "He doesn't know anything. He would never think that his exemplary wife could cheat on him, especially not with me." "You don't understand." Chanel sounded annoyed. "I know my husband. Something's going on. He was at Malcolm's clinic last week." Leroy tensed up. "Did they know about his visit to the doctor?" "So what?" Andre asked. "Just a routine checkup." "I asked Malcolm, but he refused to talk. Doctor-patient confidentiality and all that. But I thought he was hiding something. There was the sound of liquid pouring. Andre must have been pouring a drink." "Don't panic too soon, babe. Even if he suspects something, he has no proof. We're being careful." "It's been 5 years," Chanel said quietly. 5 years we've been dating behind his back. Sometimes I think we should just get out of here. Start over." Leroy felt his insides grow cold. 5 years. A third of their marriage was a lie. "You know I can't leave the bar," Andre replied. "And I'm sure you won't abandon your patients. But what if he found out? What if he found out about your illness?" There was a pause. Leroy held his breath. "I told you," Andre finally said. "I'm under control. I'm taking my meds. Viral load is almost undetectable. You have nothing to worry about." "I'm not worried about me." Chanel's voice rose. "What if Leroy got infected? What if he found out about it? You said you hardly sleep together." "Almost. But sometimes. It happens. And condoms aren't 100% guaranteed. You said so yourself." Pause again. "If he was infected and found out about it, he would have come here with a gun a long time ago," Andre joked darkly. "You know your husband. He's a man of action." "Don't say that!" Fear appeared in Chanel's voice. "Leroy can be scary when he's angry, but he never—" "I'm just kidding, baby. He's a sheriff. He won't break the law." "When did you find out about your diagnosis?" Chanel suddenly asked. "We've talked about this before. 3 years ago, after that trip to Memphis. And you didn't tell me right away. I was afraid of losing you." Andre's voice softened. "And when I realized I could infect you, it was too late. We were already too close." "You should have told me." Chanel was almost screaming now. "I'm a nurse, damn it! I would have understood." "I'm sorry. Andre said quietly. I was being selfish. But now we're both in therapy. We're under control. Everything's going to be all right. Leroy had heard enough. He carefully stepped away from the window and walked back to the car. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely get the key into the ignition. 3 years. Andre had known about his HIV status for 3 years and continued to sleep with Chanel, knowing he could infect her and possibly Leroy as well. The sheriff drove across town to an old quarry outside the city limits. The place was abandoned and deserted, perfect to be alone with one's thoughts. Leroy turned off the engine and closed his eyes. A hurricane of emotions raged inside. Rage, pain, disgust, fear. 5 years of betrayal, 3 years of conscious risk. His first thought was to go back to Andre's house, drag them both out and arrest them for what? You don't go to jail for cheating, hiding your HIV status? Maybe, but that would mean a public scandal. The whole town would know that Sheriff Washington wears horns and has HIV. Leroy slapped his hand on the steering wheel. No, he couldn't do that. He couldn't show his weakness to the entire town that had respected and feared him for 15 years. But he couldn't live with that knowledge either. Andre's words rang in his head. If he got infected and found out about it, he would have come here with a gun a long time ago. Maybe that was what they deserved? An eye for an eye? A life for a life? They took away his future, condemned him to sickness and fear. Wasn't it only fair to repay them in kind? Leroy shook his head, pushing those thoughts away. No, he's a sheriff. He serves the law. He can't. But did the law protect him? Was justice on his side? What was left for him? Live with a woman who betrayed him for years? To die slowly from the disease they gave him? The sheriff started the car and drove back to town. He drove past the house without stopping. Chanel hadn't returned yet. Her car wasn't in the driveway. Leroy headed for the station. Letitia looked up in surprise when he walked in. Chief? I thought you had the day off today. I thought I'd check something, Leroy replied in a colorless voice. You can go home. I'll close the station. Letitia paused, studying his face. Are you sure everything is all right? You haven't been yourself the last few days? I'm fine. Leroy tried to smile, but it came out badly. I'm just tired. Go on, I'll manage. After Letitia left, the sheriff locked the front door and went to the far room where the weapons were kept. A metal cabinet held service pistols, shotguns for special operations, and old revolvers. But that wasn't what interested Leroy. In the corner, behind boxes of old cases, was a hunting rifle confiscated from poachers about 10 years ago. It had never been registered and was not on the balance sheet of the site. Only Leroy and his predecessor, old Sheriff Thompson, who had been dead for 5 years, knew about it. The sheriff pulled out the shotgun, examined it. It was dusty, but in working order. He found a box of ammunition suitable for that caliber and loaded the gun. Then he wrapped the gun in an old blanket and took it out the back door. No one saw him put the package in the trunk of the squad car. Leroy returned home late that night. Chanel was in the bedroom, already in her nightgown, with a book in her hands. Late for work? She asked, not lifting her eyes from the pages. Yes, he answered briefly, studying her face. How could she be so calm, so ordinary? Now that he knew the truth, every word she said seemed false. I left dinner in the refrigerator. Not hungry? Chanel finally looked up at him. You haven't been eating lately, and you don't look so good. Maybe we should go see Malcolm. I've already been to see him, Leroy said evenly. Something in his tone made Chanel tense. What did he say? Nothing much. Leroy sat on the edge of the bed, his back to his wife. You know you have a medical supply delivery tomorrow, right? So you'll be late? Yes, Chanel answered cautiously. Until about 6 o'clock. Why? Just asking. The sheriff got up and headed for the shower. Good night. Good night, she echoed, giving him a tense look. In the morning, Leroy left earlier than usual. He left a note for Letitia saying he was checking on a report of suspicious activity in the woods near the old sawmill and not to be disturbed until the evening. Then he drove to the hunting lodge, which was about 10 miles from town. It was an abandoned structure, once owned by the forestry department, but now used by the locals for illegal hunting and clandestine meetings. Leroy knew Chanel and Andre sometimes met there. He'd seen their cars parked nearby during his observations. Today was the day of their usual meeting, a Tuesday when Andre's bar was not open, and Chanel was supposedly late for work. The sheriff parked the car a half-mile from the cabin, among the trees where it couldn't be seen from the road. Then he pulled a blanket-wrapped shotgun from the trunk and walked through the woods. The cabin looked deserted. No cars, no lights in the windows. Leroy circled it, found a good vantage point among the bushes, and sat down to wait. The hours stretched slowly, the sun was rising higher and higher, and the heat was becoming unbearable. But the sheriff did not move, patient as a predator in ambush. Toward noon, he heard the sound of an approaching car. Andre's black Jeep appeared on the forest road and parked in front of the cabin. The owner of the bar got out, looked around, and headed for the door, unlocking the lock with his key. So he had his own key. They were here often. Leroy felt rage boiling up inside. He clutched the gun so hard that his knuckles turned white. But no, not yet. He must see them together. Had to be sure. An hour later, Chanel's car showed up. She too looked around before getting out and walked quickly to the door. Andre opened it for her, and they hugged on the threshold before disappearing inside. The sheriff slowly rose from his hiding place. He felt strangely calm, as if everything that was happening was a dream. He picked up his rifle and headed toward the cabin. The windows were covered with blinds, but light shone through the gaps. Leroy cautiously crept to the door and listened to the muffled voices and laughter coming from the cabin. They were discussing some movie they had recently watched together. So ordinary, so happy, while his life lay in ruins. The sheriff took a step back and, without thinking any further, shot the door lock. The wood splintered with splinters and the door swung open. Leroy rushed inside. Andre and Chanel were sitting on the couch. They both froze in surprise, with glasses of wine in their hands. Candles were burning on the coffee table and soft music was playing. The perfect romantic date. Leroy? Chanel was the first to break the silence. There was pure, unadulterated terror in her voice. The sheriff raised his shotgun, pointing it at the couple. 5 years, he said hoarsely. 5 years you've been meeting behind my back. Andre stood up slowly, holding his hands out in front of him. Leroy, let's talk. Put the gun down and we'll talk about it. Discuss what? The sheriff grinned, and it was a terrible grin. That you slept with my wife? Or the fact that you knew about your HIV status and kept doing it anyway? Chanel turned pale. Leroy, where did you... I heard you two talking, yesterday, at his house. The sheriff shifted his gaze to his wife. 3 years he knew he was sick. 3 years he risked infecting you, and me. I'm on medication, Andre said quickly. The risk of transmission is minimal. Shut up, Leroy roared. I tested positive for HIV. You did this to me, both of you. Chanel covered her mouth with her hand, tears streaming down her face. Oh my God, Leroy, I didn't know. I didn't think. You didn't think? The sheriff interjected. You're a nurse. You knew the risks, and yet you kept sleeping with me knowing you could infect me. Leroy, please. Chanel took a step toward him. We can fix this. Modern therapy allows you to live a full life. It's not the end. It's the end for me, Leroy said quietly. There was no more anger in his voice, only boundless fatigue. You stole my life, my future, my trust. What am I left with? Andre tried to intervene again. Leroy, you're the sheriff. You can't. Don't tell me what I can and can't do! The sheriff pointed the shotgun at Andre again. I served the law for 15 years, protected the people, made this town safe, and you made my life a living hell. Please, Chanel whispered, falling to her knees. Please, Leroy, I love you. I made a mistake. 5 years isn't a mistake. The sheriff shook his head. It's a choice. You chose it. You chose to betray me, infected me. Now live with the consequences. Leroy fired twice. The first shot hit Andre in the chest, knocking him back against the wall. The second hit Chanel in the head as she screamed at the sight of her falling lover. A deafening silence hung in the small house. Only quiet music continued to play, strangely out of place amidst the bloody chaos. The candles were still burning, casting a warm glow on the motionless bodies. Leroy lowered his gun. A strange calmness swept over him. He had done what he had to do. He had done justice by his own rules. Now there was only one thing left to do. The sheriff scrutinized the cabin. No prints. He wore gloves. No witnesses. The place was too isolated. He took the shell casings and walked out, carefully covering the broken door. On the way to the car, Leroy stopped at a small creek. He threw the shotgun into the deepest spot, watching it disappear into the murky water. Then got in his car and drove back to town, looking at the cabin one last time in the rearview mirror. His path was decided. There was one last step left to take. Letitia Brown parked her patrol car outside the Claryville Police Department and glanced at her watch. It was already 8 p.m., but the sheriff's car wasn't in the parking lot. That was odd. Usually Leroy was back at the station before the end of the day, even if he was out on a call. She tried to radio him for the third time in the last 2 hours. "Sheriff Washington, are you there?" Over. Silence. Just the quiet hiss of static. Something was wrong. He'd left a note this morning to check for suspicious activity at the old sawmill, but there were no such reports on the hotline. Letitia checked. Oh, and she'd been near the sawmill today. No sign of the sheriff or his car. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed the Washingtons' home number. No one answered, then dialed the clinic where Chanel worked. The nurse at the front desk said Mrs. Washington left around noon and never came back. Anxiety was building. Leroy had been acting strangely the last few days. He was distracted, nervous, avoiding conversation. It was nothing like the sheriff she'd known for 5 years. Something was definitely wrong. Letitia decided to check out the Washington house in person. On the way, she called the Blue Moon twice, but the bar's phone didn't answer. Strange, since it was Tuesday and the bar was supposed to be open. When she pulled up to the neat one-story sheriff's house, it was dark and quiet. Chanel's car wasn't in the driveway. Letitia knocked. No answer. Peeked in the windows. The house seemed empty. Anxiety turned to worry. She called dispatch. "Jody, it's Letitia. Has the sheriff been in touch today?" "No, honey," the elderly dispatcher answered. "After he told you not to bother him until tonight, I haven't heard from him." "And any incident reports? Anything out of the ordinary?" "It's all quiet. Only Mrs. Parker called to complain about loud music next door." "Thanks, Jody. If the sheriff shows up, tell him to contact me immediately." Letitia got back in the car and wondered, where could both the sheriff and his wife be? And why wasn't the bar's cell phone answering? A sudden thought made her shudder. What if it was all connected? She decided to check out the Blue Moon in person. The bar was on the outskirts of town, just off the highway. When Letitia pulled up, the sign wasn't lit, and a closed sign hung on the door. Not a soul could be seen through the windows. The deputy sheriff walked around the building and peered through the back window. It was empty inside. No sign of Andre Jackson. She knocked on the back door. Silence. Walking back to the car, Letitia wondered. What could connect the disappearance of the sheriff, his wife, and the bar owner? Probably nothing. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But her intuition, honed by years of police work, told her otherwise. She remembered seeing Chanel's car outside the Blue Moon several times at unusual times. Remembered the tense looks between Leroy and Andre at the last town picnic. Could it have been? Letitia pushed the thought away. No, it was too much. Chanel was a devoted wife, and Leroy and Andre had once been friends, albeit estranged in recent years. But where could they all be now? She decided to check one more place. There was an old hunting lodge outside of town where the locals sometimes had parties or spent weekends. Letitia remembered the one time she and Leroy had gone there on a call. A rowdy youth party had pissed off the hunters from the neighboring property. The road to the cabin was rough and dark. The headlights of the patrol car picked out tree trunks and bushes from the darkness. As Letitia turned onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, she noticed fresh tire tracks. Someone had driven through here recently. The hunting lodge appeared from behind the trees, a simple wooden structure with a porch. Letitia shone her headlights on it and noticed an oddity. The door was ajar and appeared damaged. She turned off the engine and listened. It was quiet, with only night insects chirping in the woods. The deputy sheriff pulled out her gun and flashlight. Something wasn't right here. Slowly, treading carefully, she approached the cabin and peered inside. The flashlight's beam revealed overturned furniture, broken dishes, and in the darkness. "Oh, God!" Letitia exhaled as the light fell on Andre Jackson's body, lying against the wall in a pool of blood. Nearby, by the couch, she saw another body, Chanel Washington, with a gunshot wound to the head. Letitia stepped back, feeling nausea coming on. She quickly walked back to her car and contacted dispatch. "Jody, it's Brown. I've got a double homicide at a hunting lodge outside of town. Victims are Andre Jackson and Chanel Washington. I need backup and forensics, and get me the sheriff right away." "Chanel?" The dispatcher's voice shook. "The sheriff's wife?" "Yeah, and hurry up with backup." News of the double murder spread through Claryville like wildfire. By morning, half the town had gathered outside the hunting lodge, gawkers, reporters from the local paper, relatives of the victims. Letitia struggled to contain the crowd while forensic experts from a neighboring county worked the crime scene. Leroy showed up close to noon. He looked terrible, pale, red-eyed, in wrinkled clothes. When he was told of his wife's death, he didn't shed a tear. He just stared blankly into space. "Sheriff, where have you been?" Letitia asked, leading him away from the crowd. "I've been trying to reach you all evening and all night." "I was in Jefferson City," Leroy replied deftly. "Drove around on county business, turned off his cell phone and radio so I wouldn't be disturbed. It was weird. They had no business in Jefferson City, but Letitia didn't insist, not now that the sheriff had just learned of his wife's death. "What happened here?" Leroy asked, looking at the cabin surrounded by police tape. Letitia told him about the bodies, about how she'd found them, about the signs of a struggle, about the broken door, about the coroner's preliminary time of death between 1 and 3 yesterday afternoon. "Andre and Chanel? Together?" Leroy spoke slowly, as if considering every word. "What were they doing here?" "We don't know for sure," Letitia answered cautiously. "But it looked like a date. There were candles, wine, and music playing in the cabin." The sheriff nodded, looking somewhere through her. "I'll take over the investigation," he said. "But Chief, your wife—" "That's why I have to find whoever did this," Leroy cut him off. "I'm fine. I'll be fine." The next few days became a mad whirlwind for Letitia. Leroy became fully immersed in the investigation, working day and night. He interviewed witnesses, examined evidence, built theories. But there was something about his behavior that made the deputy suspicious. It was as if he knew where not to look. Every time the investigation seemed to be moving forward, the sheriff steered it in a different direction. At first, Letitia had suspected passing truckers. Andre's bar was frequented by strangers from the highway, but a check of the motel logs and gas station cameras revealed no suspicious persons that day. Then there was a version about drug dealers from the neighboring county. There were rumors that the Blue Moon was a transit point for pot and pills, but that version didn't check out either. "Maybe we should call in the state investigators," Letitia suggested on the 5th day of the investigation when they hit another dead end. "It's a big case, Chief. Double homicide." "No," Leroy replied sternly. "This is our town. We can handle it ourselves." Chanel's funeral took place in an atmosphere of grief and whispers. The whole town gathered at the little church to see the sheriff's wife off Leroy stood by the coffin, dry and straight as a tree trunk. Not a single tear, not a single show of emotion. Only when the priest asked if anyone wanted to say a few words did the sheriff silently shake his head and step aside. Andre was buried a day later. Leroy did not show up at his funeral, citing busyness, but Letitia had seen the sheriff watching from a distance, sitting in his car. Something was definitely wrong. Letitia felt it with every cell in her body. She began her own investigation without involving the sheriff. She talked to the clinic staff, the bar patrons, Andre's neighbors. Gradually, a picture began to emerge. Chanel and Andre were lovers, probably for years. They met in secret, usually at a hunting lodge or a motel on the way out of town. One of the bartenders at the Blue Moon told how he'd once seen them kissing in a warehouse when they thought no one could see. Could this have been a motive for murder? A jealous husband finding out about the affair? But Leroy was a sheriff, a man of the law. He couldn't, or could he? Letitia remembered the chief's strange behavior in the last days before the murder. His inexplicable nervousness, his lack of an alibi for the time of the murder. No one in Jefferson City had confirmed his presence there. But most disturbing of all was the conversation with Dr. Freeman, which she had overheard by accident. The doctor had called Leroy, wondering how he was coping with his diagnosis and whether he had started taking therapy. What was the diagnosis in question? A horrible guess began to form in Letitia's mind. What if Chanel had infected her husband with some disease from a lover? What if Leroy found out about it and couldn't handle the double betrayal? But she had no proof, only guesses and coincidences. And even if she was right, what should she do? Arrest her own boss? The man who had been a mentor and almost a father figure to her? On the 10th day of the investigation, Leroy announced that the active search had to be called off. "We have no leads," he said at a precinct briefing. "No witnesses, no clear suspects. Most likely it was a passerby, maybe a mugger, maybe a junkie." "But the robber didn't take anything of value," Letitia countered. "Wallets, watches, jewelry, everything was still there." "So he was spooked," Leroy shrugged. "Or it was a junkie on drugs acting irrationally." He looked haggard. He was thin, dark circles under his eyes, his movements slow and uncertain. The sheriff clearly hadn't slept at night. "You need a vacation," Letitia said softly when it was just the two of them. "Take a vacation, go somewhere. You'll burn out like this." "I'm fine," Leroy replied absently. "No, you're not." She summoned up all her courage. "Chief, I spoke to Dr. Freeman. He told me about your diagnosis. It was a lie. The doctor didn't tell her anything, citing doctor-patient confidentiality." But Letitia needed to see the sheriff's reaction. Leroy froze, his hand, reaching for his coffee, frozen in midair. "What exactly did he say? That you have HIV, and that you may have gotten it from your wife?" The sheriff slowly lowered his hand and looked at her with a hard stare. "And what else did he say?" "Nothing more." Letitia decided to go all in. "But I did my own investigation. Talked to people. Chanel and Andre were lovers, right? You found out about it. You found out you were sick, and you couldn't bear it." There was a heavy silence in the study. Leroy looked at her with a long, unreadable stare. Then he nodded slowly. "You've always been a smart girl, Letitia. Too smart for this place. Were you the one who killed them?" she asked bluntly, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. The sheriff didn't answer. Instead, he opened a desk drawer and pulled out an envelope. "Take this," he said, holding it out to the deputy. "But don't open it until you're out of here, promise me." "What is it?" "The answers to your questions. My last request." Something in his voice made Letitia go cold. "Leroy, what are you up to?" The sheriff smiled for the first time in a long time, a sad, tired smile. "I'm asking you to leave now. Go home. Read what's in the envelope, and then decide what to do. I trust your decision." "I can't just leave," Letitia exclaimed. "If you killed them—" "Please," Leroy said softly. "For the sake of everything I taught you, for the friendship we had. Leave now and let me finish this in my own way." She hesitated, looking at the envelope in her hands. Something told her she shouldn't leave the sheriff alone. But the other part, the part that had respected the man for years, said she should give him this last chance. "All right," Letitia finally said. "I'll leave, but promise me you won't do anything irreparable." Leroy did not answer, only nodded at the door. When she was already standing on the threshold, he called out to her, "You'll make a good sheriff, Letitia. Better than me." Once in the car, she tore open the envelope. Inside were 2 sheets. The first was Leroy's handwritten confession to the murders of Chanel and Andre, detailing the motives and circumstances. The second was his will, leaving his house and savings to Chanel's sister and her children. The last lines of the confession made Letitia go cold. "I can't live with what I've done and the illness they left me. By the time you read this, I will no longer be alive. Forgive me, Letitia, and do what you think is right." "Oh God," she exhaled and started the car. The gunshot sounded when she was 2 blocks from the station. The sound echoed through the streets of the small town and was so deafening that birds flew out of the trees. By the time Letitia burst into the sheriff's office, it was too late. Leroy Washington sat in his chair, his service pistol still clutched in his hand. A dark stain blurred on the wall behind him. In the days that followed, Letitia made the hardest decision of her life. She kept the sheriff's confession in a safe that only she had access to. The official version was suicide amid depression after losing her wife. The double murder investigation was suspended due to lack of evidence and suspects. In the reports, Letitia indicated the main version as an attack by an unknown perpetrator, possibly from a passerby. The case remained unsolved. A monument was erected on the Washington sheriff's grave with the inscription, "Guardian of Order, Defender of Justice." Every year on the day he died, Letitia brought flowers there, not as a deputy or as the new sheriff of Claryville, but simply as someone who understood that sometimes the shadows of justice hide more than the heart can bear. In a small box at home, she kept the only evidence she'd taken from the crime scene 5 years ago, a hunting rifle cartridge she'd found in the bushes by the cabin. A reminder that justice and the law are not always the same thing, and sometimes keeping a secret means protecting not only the memory of the dead, but also the peace of the living.